Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. It happened at dinner. A table full of her friends, all polished smiles and whispered jokes, sitting there like a jury waiting for my next move. It wasn't new. They'd done it before, 5 times, to be exact. 5 separate tests to see if I was good enough for her. Every time, I kept my composure, played along, stayed polite. But that night, something in me finally shifted. We were at Olive Garden. She sat across from me, her hand brushing mine as if to say, "Be nice." The girls were laughing about something trivial, relationships, loyalty, whatever passed for entertainment in their circle. Then one of them said it, half joking but with that cruel edge that always hid behind their smiles. We finally decided. He's a keeper. The table erupted in laughter. Even she laughed, though not as loudly. That's when I looked at her and said calmly, "Great. Now ask them if I should stay." Silence. The kind that strips the air from a room. Her smile froze halfway. One of the girls shifted in her seat, pretending to check her phone. The waiter, poor guy, stopped mid-step with a tray of breadsticks in his hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't glare. I just looked at her, steady, unbothered. She said nothing, not a word. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. I finished my drink, set a few bills on the table, and stood up. No scene, no emotion, just clarity. She tried to reach for my hand, but I didn't stop. I walked out, leaving the noise behind, stepping into the kind of quiet that feels more powerful than any argument. In the parking lot, I sat in my Ford F-150 for a long time, watching the restaurant lights blur through the windshield. I realized I had spent years being tested, evaluated, measured. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being her partner and became her project. When she came home later, she tried to explain. It was all harmless fun, she said. Her friends just liked to see how guys react. But the problem wasn't the test. It was that she never defended me. Not once. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just went quiet. Because when a man finally stops reacting, it's not peace. It's the beginning of his exit. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She hummed while making coffee, scrolled through her iPhone, and asked if I wanted anything from Target later. It was her usual way of pretending problems didn't exist, as if silence could erase the truth. I watched her move around the kitchen, every gesture rehearsed, every smile slightly forced. She wanted to reset things without acknowledgement. But I wasn't resetting anymore. I was observing. I didn't bring up the dinner, and she didn't either. But I noticed small details, her nervous glances, the way she overcompensated with affection, calling me babe more often than usual. It wasn't love. It was control disguised as normalcy. Around noon, I went to work and couldn't focus. The words kept echoing in my head. He's a keeper. Like I had passed some kind of social inspection, approved by her committee of friends who thought marriage was a group sport. I realized it wasn't the testing that bothered me. It was the fact that she needed validation from others to value me. That night, I got home late. She was sitting on the couch, watching Netflix, pretending to be relaxed. She asked how my day was. I said fine. She mentioned her friends again, casually, testing the waters. "They really like you now," she said. I just smiled and said, "Good for them." The words hit harder than anything I could have yelled. She went quiet for a few seconds, then turned back to the TV. That silence between us, calm, cold, and final, became its own conversation. Over the next few days, I started pulling back. I stopped trying to please her friends. I stopped showing up for the group dinners, the girls' nights, where I was always conveniently invited at the last minute to play the loyal husband in their social theater. Instead, I started spending time alone, driving, hitting the gym, having breakfast at Waffle House before work. She noticed the difference. She asked if something was wrong, but I just said, "Nothing's wrong. I'm just tired." What I didn't say was that I was tired of being a supporting actor in her performance. The moment a man stops fighting for a place in someone's approval circle, the whole dynamic collapses. And that's exactly what started happening. She had her friend's validation now, but she no longer had mine. By the 3rd week, I had stopped playing the part entirely. The man who once went out of his way to impress her friends was gone. I no longer answered their messages, didn't comment on their photos, didn't show up to their weekend plans. The more distance I created, the more uneasy she became. Her whole identity had been built around being admired by her friends, by strangers, by me. Now that admiration had turned to indifference, and she didn't know how to live in that silence. One Friday evening, she tried to bring back the old routine. She came home dressed up, hair perfect, perfume heavy in the air. She said the girls wanted to meet for dinner again and that I should come. It would look weird if I didn't. That phrase stuck with me. Look weird. Everything about her world was presentation. Appearances over substance. I told her I had plans, though I didn't. Her smile faltered for a second before she recovered. Fine, she said lightly. I'll just tell them you're busy. She left without waiting for a response. I sat there in the quiet, the clock ticking loud in the background. I wasn't angry, just detached. It felt strange at first, like stepping out of a cage and realizing you'd been the one holding the door closed the whole time. Later that night, I went to a small diner outside of town. I ordered black coffee and sat near the window, watching cars pass under the streetlights. I thought about all the times I had been tested, how easily she'd allowed others to weigh my worth. I realized that every test wasn't about me. It was about her need to feel in control of something she didn't deserve. When I got home, she was already there, scrolling on her phone, pretending to be unbothered. But her eyes betrayed her. She asked if I was upset. I said no. Then she asked if I was losing interest. I told her, no, I just stopped auditioning. The silence after that was sharp, cold, final. For the first time, I watched her run out of words. She didn't know how to fight a man who no longer cared to win. That was the night everything shifted. Because once you stop trying to prove your worth, the person who kept testing you starts to realize they were never the prize to begin with. The next week felt different. She started reaching for me in ways she hadn't before. Soft touches on the shoulder, texts during work asking if I'd eaten, small attempts at closeness. But it wasn't love. It was panic disguised as affection. When control begins to slip, people don't become honest. They become desperate. One evening, she came home from dinner with her friends, smelling like wine and insecurity. She sat next to me on the couch, nervous, almost rehearsed. She said her friends had asked about us, about why I hadn't been around lately. She tried to make it sound like casual curiosity, but I could hear the fear underneath. I didn't look up from my phone. I just said, maybe they should ask themselves why you let them judge me in the first place. She didn't respond. She just sat there, silent, her expression crumbling in real time. The next day, I woke up early and went for a drive. The air was cool, the roads empty. I stopped by a Waffle House for breakfast, ordered coffee, and watched the morning crowd come and go. It struck me how peaceful life felt without her friends' constant opinions clouding everything. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't being watched, graded, or tested. I was just existing. Later that afternoon, she tried again. This time she cooked dinner, something she rarely did anymore. She smiled too much, laughed too loud. I could tell she was trying to bring back what had already died. After we ate, she asked if I was still upset about the dinner thing. I told her I wasn't upset. I was just done proving myself. She went quiet, then said softly, "You're acting different." I said, "I'm finally acting like myself." That's when I saw it, fear. Not of losing me, but of losing control over how I saw her. That night, she stayed up late, sitting in the dark living room long after I went to bed. I could hear the quiet sound of her phone, maybe scrolling through old photos, maybe texting someone for reassurance. But for me, something had already shifted. I didn't want to be chosen by committee anymore. I wanted peace, and I'd finally realized peace doesn't need validation. She had spent years letting her friends decide who I was. Now she was realizing the only opinion that mattered was the one that had gone silent, mine. By the end of that week, her mask had completely cracked. The woman who used to walk around with confidence now moved carefully, measuring her words like she was afraid to trigger something in me. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just stayed quiet, and that silence became the loudest thing in the house. Saturday night, her friends came over. I hadn't been told, of course. I came downstairs to grab a drink and saw them sitting in the living room, wine glasses in hand, laughter echoing through the house like nothing had happened. When they noticed me, the laughter faded. I could feel their eyes scanning me, like they were trying to guess whether I'd forgiven her. One of them, the loudest one, always the self-appointed leader, smiled and said, "There he is. The famous husband we can't stop testing." I didn't smile back. I just looked at her and said, "You must be proud of how your experiments turned out." Then I walked past them, grabbed my keys, and left. When I came back hours later, the house was dark. She was waiting on the couch, mascara streaked, wine glass half empty. She said her friends didn't mean any harm, that it was all just girls being girls. I told her, "It's not about them. It's about the fact that you let it happen. Every time." She started crying, asking what I wanted her to say. I said, "Nothing. Just stop pretending you respect me when your actions say otherwise." I went upstairs after that, leaving her in the quiet she'd created. The next morning, she tried to act normal again, made pancakes, kissed my shoulder as if last night hadn't happened. But the difference was, I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't angry or cold. I was just indifferent. And indifference is something no one can fight against. That day, I took a long drive to clear my head. I stopped at a Starbucks, sat by the window, and watched couples pass by. I wondered how many of them were living behind the same kind of performance we'd perfected for years. Smiles in public, distance in private. When I got home, she was gone. No note, no message. Just her perfume faintly lingering in the air. For the first time, the house didn't feel empty. It felt honest. She had spent so long letting others define my worth. Now she was the one trying to figure out hers, alone. She stayed gone for 3 days. No calls, no messages. Just quiet. I didn't chase her. I didn't check in with her friends to ask where she was. I knew she expected me to. She always did. It had been our unspoken pattern. She would pull away, and I would follow. But this time, the silence worked both ways. And that's when I realized, what she thought was power had always been permission. Permission I was finally done giving. On the 4th day, she came back. I heard the sound of her car in the driveway before I saw her. When she walked in, she looked exhausted. No makeup, hair tied back, her expression somewhere between pride and regret. She asked if we could talk. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. She sat across from me at the kitchen table like a stranger, trying to find her place in a house she no longer recognized. She started explaining everything I already knew. How her friends never liked the idea of her settling down too early. How they thought testing me would keep things exciting. How she went along with it because she didn't want to look weak in front of them. Every sentence felt like a confession she had rehearsed too many times. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, quietly stirring my coffee. Then she said something that almost sounded honest. "They said you passed all their tests. That you're loyal, calm, reliable." She paused. "But I guess I failed mine." I looked at her and said, "You didn't fail their test. You failed mine." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. She blinked a few times, realizing this wasn't a conversation. It was a closing statement. Tears started forming, and for a moment, I saw the same woman I'd fallen for years ago. The one who looked at me like I was enough without a committee's approval. But that version of her was long gone, buried under years of pride and influence. After a long silence, she whispered, "Is this it?" I said, "It was it the night you let them decide who I was." She didn't argue. She just nodded, stood up, and walked toward the door. As the sound of her footsteps faded, I realized something important. Sometimes you don't lose people. You just finally see who they are when the crowd leaves. And once you see that clearly, you stop waiting for them to come home. A week passed after that conversation, and the house stayed quiet. She didn't come back this time. The absence didn't ache like it used to. It settled in, familiar and peaceful. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. I started sleeping better, eating better, thinking clearly for the first time in years. It's strange how quickly peace can replace love when the noise finally stops. I began noticing small details about my days that I'd ignored before. The sound of birds outside in the morning, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, sunlight hitting the walls just right. Life had become simple again. I didn't realize how exhausting it had been to live in constant judgment until it was gone. Her friends stopped trying to reach out after a while. Maybe they realized they weren't welcome in this version of my life. Or maybe they just didn't care once the drama ended. That's the thing about people who feed on chaos. They leave when the noise dies. One afternoon, I ran into her by accident at a Target parking lot. It was awkward at first. She was carrying a few bags, wearing a simple sweatshirt and jeans, no armor, no performance. She smiled, small and careful. I nodded politely. We stood there in silence. Two people who had once shared everything now reduced to strangers making polite eye contact under the midday sun. She said she'd been doing better, working more, keeping to herself, learning who she was without all the noise. Then she looked at me and said softly, "You were right. I let other people run our relationship like it was some game." I said, "It was never about them. It was about the moment you stopped standing beside me." She nodded slowly. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just said, "I guess I needed to lose you to see that." There was nothing left to add. I wished her well and walked away. For the first time, she didn't call after me, didn't ask for another chance. Just watched quietly as I left. Driving home, I realized that silence had come full circle. The same silence she once used as a weapon had become my shield. She used to let her friends test me to see if I was worth keeping. Now life had tested her, and this time, she finally understood who failed. After that day in the Target parking lot, weeks turned into months. I didn't hear from her again. Not a text, not a call. It was as if she'd finally accepted that silence was the only language left between us. And strangely, that made me respect her again, not as a partner, but as a person who had finally learned when to stop speaking. My life had moved on quietly. I started running in the mornings, stopped checking my phone first thing when I woke up. I filled the house with new energy, different furniture, new paint, even a few plants she would have hated. It wasn't revenge, it was renewal. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I got a message from an unknown number. The name didn't show, but I knew the tone. It was her. She wrote, "I wanted to say thank you for walking away when I didn't deserve it. It forced me to grow." I read it twice and didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because some messages don't need answers. They just need to be released. The next morning, I stopped at Starbucks before work. While waiting for my coffee, I saw a couple at a nearby table. She was laughing too loudly, and he looked just a little unsure of himself, like he was being evaluated. It reminded me of who I used to be, someone always trying to earn his place in a relationship built on shifting ground. I left before my drink was ready. I didn't need the reminder. That weekend, I drove out to the lake, the same one where I used to take her when things were still good. The air smelled like pine and calm water. I sat on the hood of my Ford F-150, watching the reflection of the sunset ripple across the surface. For the first time, I felt completely still, not sad, not angry, just centered. I thought about how many times I'd been tested, not realizing the real test was whether I'd ever have the strength to walk away. That's what no one tells you about respect. It's not earned by passing someone else's standards. It's built by refusing to let them define you. She once needed her friends to tell her I was a keeper. Now she finally knew the truth. I was never hers to keep. I was the one who learned how to let go. A few months later, I ran into one of her friends, Lauren, at a coffee shop downtown. The same friend who had once smirked across the table during one of those so-called tests. She almost didn't recognize me at first. I could see the surprise in her eyes when she realized I wasn't broken. I wasn't bitter. I was better. She gave a hesitant smile and said, "You look different." I just nodded. She asked how I'd been, if I'd talked to my ex lately. I told her no, and that it wasn't something I thought about anymore. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to find something polite to say, then muttered, "She really regrets everything, you know." I smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because I had already predicted that would happen. Regret always arrives after consequences. I told her, sometimes you have to lose someone steady to realize how chaotic your world really was. She didn't know what to say after that. She grabbed her drink and left. Driving home, I thought about how strange it was. The same people who once judged me were now living lives full of their own noise. The same games they encouraged her to play were now playing them. Life has a way of evening things out, just not always when you expect it. That night, I sat on the back porch, listening to the crickets hum in the dark. The house felt like mine again, peaceful, balanced, untouched by outside voices. I thought about her for the first time in weeks, not with pain, but with understanding. She wasn't evil. She was just lost in a world that rewards people for treating love like competition. I had once been her stability, her mirror, her proof that she could control something. When I stopped reacting, that mirror cracked. And when it did, she had to finally face her reflection alone. I poured myself a drink and leaned back in the chair, the air cool and quiet around me. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need closure from her. I had given it to myself the night I stopped auditioning for her approval. She once needed her friends to tell her I was a keeper. Now I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd made the right choice. The silence that used to divide us had finally become my peace. It was almost a year later when I saw her again. I hadn't expected it. I was grabbing groceries at Walmart, half distracted, when I heard my name behind me. I turned, and there she was, different, but familiar. No makeup, no crowd, no performance. Just her, standing in the aisle with a quiet kind of humility that I'd never seen before. She smiled softly, almost uncertainly. She said it was good to see me, that she'd heard I'd been doing well. I nodded, polite but distant. She hesitated, then said, "You look at peace." I told her, "That's because I stopped living in other people's noise." She looked down, a small, painful smile tugging at her lips. We ended up standing there longer than I expected, surrounded by shelves of things we used to buy together. She told me she'd moved to a smaller place, cut ties with most of her old friends. She said it hit her one night. How much of her life had been about being seen, not being happy. How she'd spent so much energy getting validation from people who didn't even know how to love themselves. Then she looked at me and said, "You were the only one who didn't try to compete with me. You just stood there, solid." I mistook that for weakness. I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. She asked if there was any chance we could talk again sometime. Not to fix things, but to understand them. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just told her, "You don't owe me understanding. You owe yourself honesty." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "I finally learned that." We stood there for a few seconds, both knowing this was the end. Not dramatic, not bitter, just clear. She thanked me quietly, said goodbye, and walked away. I watched her go, her figure disappearing down the aisle like a chapter finally closing itself. When I stepped outside, the air felt light. The kind of lightness that only comes after years of carrying someone else's weight. I drove home, pulled into the driveway, and sat for a while before going inside. There was no music, no message, no ending quote. Just peace. She once let her friends test me to decide if I was worth keeping. Now life had tested us both, and it finally decided who stayed strong when the noise stopped. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.